I'm Bonnie Wolf, managing editor of AmericanFoodRoots.com. I'm in the kitchen at Hill Center in Washington, D.C. with three historians who are going to add to the museum's discussion of warfare through a series of videos.
My name is Julia Irwin, and I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of South Florida. I specialize in U.S. foreign relations, American humanitarianism, and especially U.S. foreign relief during World War I.
I'm Helen Veit. I'm an assistant professor of history at Michigan State University. I specialize in food in the World War I era, and I work on food history generally.
I'm Amanda Moniz. I'm the assistant director of the National History Center of the American Historical Association. I'll be making some of the recipes from the World War I cookbooks.
Americans had been affected by World War I before they even entered the fray. Is that right?
Absolutely. Food aid to Europeans was one of the first major international food aid projects that Americans ever had.
We often think about American entry into World War I starting in 1917, which is when the U.S. military entered the war. But the war itself had been going on since 1914, and Americans were involved in their kitchens. They were saving food to send to European soldiers and civilians. There was not a rationing system, but they were encouraged to voluntarily save their food to help European children and women and soldiers keep fighting.
In fact, the war itself was hugely disruptive of agriculture in Europe. There were trains suddenly running through what had been farmlands, and one of the big stories is that millions of farmers left for the trenches to fight, so European agricultural production went way down, and lots of people were going hungry.
Yeah, so the United States became a major supplier to the Allies, especially to Britain and to France, supplying wheat for bread, supplying meat, sugar, these precious sources of calories, fats as well.
Americans were very humanitarian.
American involvement in the war is not just military involvement. Humanitarian involvement is a type of participation in the war.
And wasn't this around the time of the Progressive Era?
Absolutely. The Progressive Era was a time of big social reform in general in the United States, a time when all sorts of people became interested in the idea of positive social change, in the idea of progress. And food was one big way that people tried to make changes and to reform things. Once America actually entered World War I officially in 1917, the president, Woodrow Wilson, created a mandate to make a U.S. Food Administration, which was a temporary wartime agency that aimed explicitly to export as much food as possible to Western Europe, both to allies and also to U.S. soldiers at that point. And that started a huge conservation effort around the country to try to get Americans to eat less of the products that they were trying to export: wheat, beef, pork, sugar, and butter.
And I think it's also important to point out it was a voluntary effort. So Herbert Hoover, who was the head of the American Food Administration, decided that he didn't want to make this a legal mandate. So Americans were very much voluntarily encouraged to save food, to conserve food.
They had housewives sign pledges saying that they would voluntarily conserve food, and by the Food Administration's reckoning, about 70% of American families did that.
And I think it's important to remember that children, too, were really encouraged to play a role. In the schools, they were encouraged to make gardens and to save food themselves, to collect and donate food. So children themselves become involved in the war effort in really important ways.
In the upcoming videos, we serve a meal of World War I recipes. We start with date salad and peanut butter soup, go on to soybean croquettes and cornmeal rolls, and finally, braised tongue and mandalay salad. Dessert, maple cake, a meal from soup to nuts.